Shabbat Shalom, everyone. For the past 70 plus years, my parents have been living in a beautiful Arab home in Jerusalem. Israelis call that kind of homes Arab homes. It's actually something that is rare and considered special and beautiful and more expensive. Those are houses where Arab residents of the country lived in prior to 1948. And in the War of Independence in 1948, when the Israeli army won the war, they fled or were forced to flee, and those abandoned houses were sold to Jews, only Jews by the state of Israel, and Jews are now living in them, and my parents have been living there almost since the War of Independence for more than 70 years. Before 1967, the 6 Days War, nobody wanted to live in our neighborhood. Our house was about 150 yards from the border, the Jordanian border, and from time to time, Jordanian snipers and Israeli snipers exchanged fire, and it was not the best location in the world to be in between those exchanges of fire. One of my first memories is being taught that when you go outside to play, there are certain parts of the neighborhood that you do not go next to them. In fact, my parents always told a story about our first visit, my first visit to New York when we went to see my grandparents, my mother's parents. And after a day, I cried to them and I said, I want to go back to Israel. I don't like those people. And my mother said, why don't you like my parents, your grandparents? And I said, we've been here for a whole day and they haven't shown us the border. How would we know where to go and where not to go? Growing in the divided city of Jerusalem, it was clear to me that everywhere in the world there has to be a border, and it has to be a border with an enemy that you are afraid of. It kind of changed in 1967, but not that much. Jerusalem became so-called united. The other part of my parents' neighborhood, Abu Tor, was conquered by the Israeli army, so was all of Jerusalem, and so was all of the West Bank. And the residents, the Palestinian residents of the West Bank and of Jerusalem have been living under Israeli occupation for more than 50 years. And I want to share something that happened to us as a family that kind of bursts the bubble of euphoria that all of Israel was entangled with right after 1967 and the great victory of the 6 Days War. One day, we heard a knock on the door. The only people in the house were my dad and myself, and my father opened the door. There was an elderly lady, and someone that looked to me then as an old man. He was probably 40, she was probably 65. And they were both Arabs, Palestinians, residents of Ramallah, and they wanted to see the house that was theirs until 1948, when they had to flee during the night. It was clear, even to me, a 6.5-year-old boy, that the man was shamed and embarrassed and didn't want to be there and didn't want to come there and was forced by his mother that wanted to see the house that in her eyes belonged to them. You see, in our eyes, it was our house. We bought it legally from the Israeli government, from the Department to Abandoned Property. We had the legal documents that showed that we owned the house. In their house, in their eyes, it was their house. They never sold it to us. They had the legal documents that showed that they owned that house for over 160 years, and it was going in their families. It actually was documents both from the Ottoman Turkish authorities, from the English Mandate, and then from the Jordanian kingdom, or whatever it's called. They had more documents than us, if that is a war between lawyers. The mother asked to see my brother's room because they left jewelry and valuable things in there. My dad explained that when my mom and him bought the house, it was totally abandoned and in terrible shape because it was looted before that, but she did not believe. The man was clearly embarrassed and ashamed of his mother, but she went to the room, she looked in all the places where she left jewelry, and obviously nothing was there. The happy end of that story on a personal level is that they became really good friends of my parents. For years, they would come over for Passover, and we would go over their house for some holidays. They were a Christian family, they were not a Muslim family, and I ate the best food I ever ate in my life in their house. And when they came to our house for Passover, they got matzot and matzah ball soup, so I think we got the better part of the deal altogether. As a child, I all of a sudden realized that the house that I was living in, that was morally and legally my parents' house, was also belonging to another family, morally and legally. And as an adult, I realized later on that the country where I was born, the country that I'm a citizen of, the state of Israel, is not only ours, it doesn't belong only to Jews. It definitely belongs morally and legally also to the non-Jewish citizens, what we call Israeli Arabs and what they call themselves Palestinian with Israeli citizens. And even though they vote and can be elected, they are discriminated both legally and in real life. But I also realized that the residents of the occupied territories, the Palestinians who do not have an Israeli citizens, who do not have the right to vote or to be elected, who do not have freedom of movement, who do not have freedom of labor, who could not live to another country if they want, and are living more than 50 years under an occupation that is not becoming easier year to year, they also have a claim to that land. I am proud to say that my parents and their new acquired friends that are not alive anymore realized that and were able to form a connection. And I hope and pray for a day where all the residents of Israel will realize that, and then Jerusalem will actually become what our sources call it. Our sources call Jerusalem Ir Shel Shalom, a city of Shalom. And right now, sadly enough, as our hearts are torn when we read the news, Shalom is very far from the city of Jerusalem. Shabbat Shalom.